Well, kind of following along in the theme of poultry and spring, we figured, given that we've got a lot of experience with both, we would do a video kind of going through, I'm not going to say pros and cons or which one's better, but looking at some differences or some things to think about between raising chickens versus raising ducks. So as we talked about in our recent video about sort of poultry we've had over the years and why we have what we do and why we don't have certain things, as you see in the background, we still have chickens and we no longer raise ducks, but we raised ducks for a very long time. And I think ducks and chickens are very evenly matched in a lot of aspects of raising them, but there are some major differences, as it were. So before we even get into this video really isn't which one's better. It's just things to think about, because I think the answer to the question of which is better, ducks versus chickens, really depends on your situation. So going into some of the differences, I think probably the best place to start, and probably the most obvious, is water consumption. There's a very substantial difference between ducks and chickens on this aspect. Chickens obviously still need water, but they pretty much are only using it to drink. Even though when it's very hot, they will consume a fair bit of water, they drink nothing compared to ducks. So our experiences with ducks in the past is ducks require an exorbitant amount of water for their size. And to keep ducks in really good shape, good feather condition, especially in the winter months, you're gonna want to provide water. And ideally water that they can get in and fully bathe, because the difference here with ducks is ducks have, and all waterfowl actually, have an oil gland at the base of their tail. If they can't use water to spread that oil, their feathers don't stay in good shape. And although ducks are extremely hardy, which is another point we'll get to in a moment, they just stay in much better condition if their feathers are in good condition, which makes sense. It's that old adage of water off a duck's back. So before I get going kind of too far into this, I want to make a note of something that I think a lot of people may not think about or realize, and that's when you're talking about domestic ducks. Domestic ducks are actually derived from two completely unrelated different wild species. So the mallard, which I think most of people in the world are pretty familiar with because they're pretty much everywhere. A lot of the breeds are derived from them, so they call them mallard-derived breeds, while the other species is the Muscovy duck, which is actually from sort of Central America, Northern South America, and even very, very extreme southern part of North America. Very different birds. Now, the next point, and why I brought that up, is the next point is noise. So when you're comparing chickens versus ducks, they're kind of reverse of one another. Everybody knows it's the roosters who make a lot of noise, and for a lot of people, depending on where you are, how much property you own, what your bylaws may be, you're not allowed to have roosters because on cue, as you just heard there, the roosters make a very distinct noise that a lot of people don't like. And the hens tend to be the quieter, even though they are talkative too when it comes to chickens. But with ducks, at least mallard-derived ducks, it's exactly the opposite. The drakes are not silent, but very quiet. You can have a lot of drakes and nobody would really know you have them. They tend to have a very quiet, grunting kind of sound that they make. It's not even really a full-on quack. But the female ducks are the exact opposite, and they are extremely talkative. At least, again, with the mallard-derived breeds. And depending on the breed and the size of the breed, the bigger the breed of mallard-derived duck, the louder they tend to be. And they tend to, unlike roosters who tend to crow once or twice and then there's a break in between, they're very talkative. So you can have periods where they just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. What's interesting about that is sometimes people don't find that as obtrusive for whatever the reason, but just keep that in mind. Ducks can be very loud and very talkative. Now, going back to the different species, the Muscovy, they are virtually silent. They tend to hiss and make very quiet noises. So when you're talking noise levels, the mallard-derived breeds are definitely at the top. Chickens are probably one step below, but those Muscovy-derived ducks, they're very quiet, to the point you likely wouldn't even know you had them, or your neighbors wouldn't know you had them. But we'll come to another point about them in a second. The next thing to sort of talk about, I think, is food and foraging ability. We kind of talk about them together because there's definitely overlap. Chickens really run the gamut. There are breeds that are amazing, phenomenal foragers, and there are breeds that are not, because chickens have been changed. Some breeds of chickens are very, very different from their wild ancestors, which makes sense. Both ducks and chickens are technically omnivores, though I would suggest, and you could debate this, but I would suggest the ducks are a little more on the herbivore side of the omnivore spectrum, whereas the chickens definitely like animal matter, given the choice. Now, both ducks and chickens are big insect eaters. I would say they're about the same there. They're both very good at catching insects, and they will spend a lot of time out foraging for those items. But I do think the chickens on a homestead scale are probably slightly easier to feed because of the fact that they will eat a much broader range of items that you could potentially reuse or divert to the chickens. It's not that the ducks won't, but a chicken essentially is designed for picking out little pieces of stuff, so they can go through and they can clean up an awful variety, whereas the ducks are built, even the Muscovies, with kind of a shovel, and so they're really good at basically exactly that, shoveling in a fair bit of food relatively quickly, which is why I'm kind of talking about foraging and sort of ability to find stuff on sort of pasture, as it were, is the ducks, in our experience, are actually a little better at grazing. We found, although the ducks still require space, that they don't destroy the pasture, and I'm going to quantify that in a second. They don't destroy the pasture as quickly as the chickens because they don't constantly dig it up, with a major caveat there. But if you have pasture, and ducks really like lawn grass type pasture and clover and that sort of thing, they will consume a large quantity of it. And that's one sort of negative to the duck. We found that if they were raised in confinement and they didn't have access to that, especially your growing birds, they didn't do well. So there's a lot of nutrients that they are getting from that pasture, and I'm going to say it, that they actually need from that pasture, versus the chickens, that because they will consume a much, much broader range of food items, they can kind of be done in more confinement. Plus, I'm going to say it this way too, there's been far more research done on commercial chicken feed than there has on commercial duck feed. So I kind of hesitated there a little bit on the matter of destroying pasture because I think this is where both ducks and chickens have some disadvantages, but they're very different when it comes to raising them outside with access to pasture and forage. A lot of you know chickens are big diggers. Whether you have a garden or a flower bed, etc., chickens will find that, and chickens will turn it over like there's no tomorrow. That can be an exceptionally great feature about chickens, but it can also be a horrible feature about chickens. Ducks, when the pasture is dry, typically don't dig. But in the case of mallard-derived breeds, Muscovies do this far less because of their feeding strategy and just being a different species. Mallard-derived breeds are big diggers when it's wet. That term of puddle duck, or puddle ducking as a phrase, that's where it comes from, is mallards are really good at taking their bill and finding some soft sediment, mud, soil, and they sift like there's no tomorrow, which can do a lot of damage. So one thing we found was the chickens had the potential to damage your pastures, pending the space they had, more kind of year round, although the more space they had, the less damage they did because they would target certain areas. The ducks really didn't hurt the pasture except for 2 times a year, in the spring when everything's super wet and muddy, and again in the fall when you kind of get those shoulder season mud periods. So that's definitely something to think about. Now, another thing about ducks is when the pasture starts to dry out, because they have large feet, they will compact your soil a bit, pending the amount of space they have, i.e. if you were allowing them out onto a large pasture, that's probably not going to be any real impact. But if you're keeping them in a smaller space, when that soil is still fairly wet, they do have a tendency to compact it just because they've got big feet. So another thing about ducks versus chickens, and this is something that I think only applies if you're trying to get your birds to go broody. In our many years of keeping ducks and chickens, we basically worked with a lot of broody hens of both. And the one big difference is when chickens go broody, they can be moved. So you can take that broody hen, and we recommend doing it at night when they're not really going to be paying a lot of attention. And we can link a video up above that we sort of talk about this. But a nest of eggs and a broody hen from chickens can be moved somewhere to make managing them easier. Ducks, especially the mallard-derived ducks, don't work the same. So you have to plan things out a bit better, that wherever you're trying to encourage them to go broody, that's where they're going to sit for the duration of their incubation. That doesn't sound like a big difference, but when you're getting into managing birds in that way, it can make a huge difference on your thinking ahead and planning. I think really at that point, there's lots of other things you could talk about: egg laying abilities, growth rates, hardiness, etc. But I think a lot of that does go into the specific breeds, i.e. there are breeds of chickens that are far less hardy than any breed of duck. There are ducks that grow far faster than any kind of chicken. But you're going to have to get into the specifics of what breed you want and why you want those breeds. But both ducks and chickens offer a lot of different options and possibilities for finding something that's going to work well for you. So even though we no longer have ducks, I really would say they're pretty equally matched, and they really make a good option as a homestead poultry if you're trying to do things on a small scale. They're both very productive. They're both very easy to manage. One little final bonus thing that I will say about ducks versus chickens, I guess it's actually going to be two things, is most of you know how hard it is to herd chickens. Chickens don't typically herd very well. Ducks, on the other hand, except for Muscovy breeds, they are a little bit more like chickens. Ducks herd amazingly. So you can have quite a number of them, and if you decide, hey, we've got to go and put them in for the night and it's a little bit early, you can herd them and do that. Whereas with chickens, you're pretty much waiting on their terms often to get them to go back in. Now the flip side to that, where I think chickens are a little better, at night, chickens go pretty dormant. They're asleep. They don't really see what's going on. So handling chickens in a calm way is so easy to do at night. Ducks, on the other hand, they stay active all night, and especially on nights when it's nice, bright, moonlit night, because they see in the dark about the same, with the same amount of vision as a human. So handling them at night is actually a nightmare. And I would say from our experience, handling them in the daytime is the way to go, because at night, panic will set in. They'll be a lot louder, and it just won't be a very enjoyable experience. I don't know if this is really definitive if you're trying to decide ducks versus chickens, but I definitely would say it's things to think about, because chickens are always the go-to. They are the gateway animal, and I think people just automatically assume that they're going to be easier and it's going to work out better than anything else. But even though we no longer have ducks, we're still big advocates for ducks. We still think they can work for a lot of people, and they're probably a little bit underrated. Really, there's only one reason that we don't have ducks anymore, and the reality of it is because we have geese, and that is going to be a topic for another video where we sort of look at the difference between ducks and geese on a homestead scale.